My wife accused me of getting her sister pregnant and kicked me out. Then a DNA test changed everything. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we begin today's emotional story, I would like to ask for your support. If you enjoy powerful and heartfelt stories like this one, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you will always be among the first to know whenever we publish a new video. It only takes a few seconds. It is completely free, and your support helps us continue bringing you touching, inspiring, and unforgettable stories. We sincerely appreciate every single one of you. We would also love to know where you are watching from today. Please share your city or your country in the comments so we can welcome viewers from all around the world. Thank you for spending your time with us. Now, let us turn our attention back to our main character and begin today's story. The cruelest lies are the ones spoken by the people who once promised to protect you. Marcus Bennett had replayed that night in his mind more times than he could count, and no matter how many times he searched for the moment everything went wrong, he always returned to the same image. Danielle stood in the middle of their living room with tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling around a stack of medical papers she refused to let him touch. The house they had spent 6 years building together suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if every family photograph on the wall belonged to strangers instead of the life they had shared. Marcus had barely stepped through the front door after finishing another long shift at work when he realized something was terribly wrong. Danielle wasn't alone. Her younger sister, Alicia, sat silently on the couch with her eyes fixed on the hardwood floor, while Danielle's parents stood near the fireplace wearing expressions that carried disappointment before a single word had even been spoken. The silence felt heavier than any argument Marcus had ever experienced. He set his car keys on the entry table and forced a cautious smile. "What's going on?" he asked softly, hoping someone would explain the tension that filled every corner of the room. Danielle answered by throwing a sealed medical envelope onto the coffee table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped inches from his hand. "Don't pretend you don't know," she said, her voice cracking between anger and heartbreak. Marcus stared at the envelope without opening it. His heartbeat quickened as he looked from Danielle to Alicia, searching for some clue that would help him understand what was happening. Alicia never looked up. Danielle folded her arms tightly across her chest. "My sister is pregnant," she whispered, and for one brief second Marcus felt genuine concern for Alicia. Then Danielle added the words that shattered everything. "She says you're the father." The room seemed to lose all sound. Marcus blinked once, convinced he had misunderstood her. "What?" he asked, almost laughing in disbelief before realizing no one else was smiling. Danielle's father slowly shook his head. Her mother wiped away a tear without saying anything. Marcus looked directly at Alicia. "Tell them that's not true," he pleaded. She remained motionless, her fingers twisting together in her lap, as though she couldn't bear to meet his eyes. That silence was louder than any accusation. Danielle interpreted it as confirmation. "I trusted you," she said, her voice breaking. "I defended you every time someone said people couldn't be trusted. I built my entire future around you." Marcus took one careful step toward her, stopping several feet away so she wouldn't feel cornered. "Danielle, I have never crossed that line with Alicia. I swear to you, I don't know why she's saying this." Danielle took a step backward instead. "Stop lying." Marcus searched every face in the room, hoping someone would ask a question, demand proof, or simply give him the chance to explain. No one did. Their verdict had already been reached before he walked through the door. Danielle picked up a packed suitcase that Marcus had never seen before and placed it beside the entrance. "You need to leave," she said quietly. Marcus stared at the suitcase, then back at the woman he still loved. "You're throwing me out without even hearing me?" Danielle closed her eyes for a long moment before opening the front door. The cool evening air drifted inside as she whispered the words that echoed through his life long after he stepped onto the porch. "I don't know who you are anymore." Marcus lifted the suitcase without another argument because he realized that nothing he said would matter tonight. As the front door slowly closed behind him, he stood alone beneath the porch light, unaware that somewhere beyond the accusations, beyond the silence, and beyond the pain, one simple DNA test was already waiting to expose a truth that none of them could imagine. Marcus spent his first night inside a roadside motel, less than 3 miles from the home he had once believed would be his forever. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and industrial cleaner, and the humming air conditioner struggled against the humid summer night. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed without turning on the television, staring instead at his wedding band resting in the palm of his hand. Less than 24 hours earlier, it had represented commitment, trust, and a future built together. Now it felt like a silent reminder that a lifetime could collapse before a person even understood what was happening. Sleep never came. Every time Marcus closed his eyes, he saw Danielle standing in the doorway, refusing to believe a single word he said. What hurt him most was not the accusation itself. It was the certainty in her voice. She had looked at him as though she had already erased every memory they had ever shared. As dawn broke through the motel curtains, Marcus drove to his office hoping routine would quiet the storm inside his mind. He worked as a regional operations supervisor for a national distribution company, and deadlines rarely waited for personal tragedy. His coworkers noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes, but Marcus simply blamed another sleepless night. He could not bear to repeat the story because saying the words aloud would make the nightmare feel even more real. Around lunchtime, his phone vibrated repeatedly. Family members, old friends, and even distant relatives had begun leaving messages. Some demanded explanations. Others expressed disappointment without asking a single question. A few simply wrote that they never expected this from him. Marcus stared at the screen before placing the phone face down on his desk. Rumors moved faster than truth, especially when people believed they were protecting someone they loved. That evening, he returned to the motel instead of home. Home no longer belonged to him. He unpacked only a few shirts, folded them neatly inside a dresser drawer, and realized how little of his life actually fit into one suitcase. The following morning, his attorney called after receiving notice that Danielle had officially filed for divorce. Marcus listened quietly as the legal process was explained, but one sentence stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Danielle was requesting an expedited proceeding because she claimed there was an irreparable breach of trust. Marcus thanked the attorney, ended the call, and sat silently inside his car for several minutes. He remembered the day he first met Danielle at a neighborhood volunteer event in Atlanta. She had laughed so easily that strangers found themselves smiling with her. She believed in family above everything else, and Marcus admired that quality because he had grown up believing loyalty was the strongest foundation any relationship could have. Over the years, he had attended birthdays, holiday dinners, graduation parties, and countless family gatherings with Danielle's relatives. Alicia had always been treated like a younger sister. He had helped her move into her first apartment, fixed a broken water heater after a winter freeze, and encouraged her when she struggled through nursing school. Never once had he viewed her as anything other than family. That was why the accusation made no sense. The pieces refused to fit together no matter how many times Marcus replayed every conversation, every holiday, and every ordinary moment they had shared. Late that evening, he opened an old photo album on his phone. Pictures from vacations, cookouts, church events, and anniversary dinners filled the screen. In every photograph, Danielle's smile looked genuine, and Alicia often stood beside them laughing as though they were inseparable. Marcus slowly closed the gallery, without deleting a single image. Deep inside, beyond the heartbreak and humiliation, one question refused to leave him. If he had done nothing wrong, why had Alicia chosen him? And what truth was still hiding behind the silence that had destroyed his entire life? The days that followed became a quiet test of everything Marcus Bennett believed about character, patience, and truth. He quickly discovered that losing his home had been only the beginning. Losing his reputation was far more painful because it happened one conversation at a time. At work, people who had once greeted him with easy smiles now spoke with careful distance. No one confronted him directly, but he noticed conversations ending as he approached the break room. Friendly invitations to lunch quietly disappeared. Even the security guard who had joked with him every morning simply nodded without making eye contact. Marcus understood what had happened before anyone needed to explain it. Rumors had traveled through friends, relatives, and social media until they reached people who barely knew him. The story had grown larger with every retelling, and somewhere along the way, suspicion had become accepted as fact. One Saturday afternoon, he drove to the neighborhood grocery store he and Danielle had visited every weekend for years. He reached automatically for the same shopping cart they always used before remembering he was shopping for one person now. As he walked through the produce section, he noticed an older couple from their church standing near the fruit display. They recognized him immediately. The husband offered a polite nod, but his wife gently guided the cart in another direction without saying hello. Marcus stood motionless for a moment, staring at the rows of apples before quietly continuing down the aisle. He felt no anger toward them. They believed they were protecting Danielle because they thought they already knew the truth. What hurt was realizing that almost no one had asked for his side of the story. That evening, his attorney called with another update. Danielle intended to move forward with the divorce as quickly as possible, and there was still no indication that Alicia planned to change her statement. Marcus thanked the attorney before asking the question that had occupied every waking hour. "Can we request a DNA test?" There was a brief silence before the attorney answered. "Yes, but everyone involved has to cooperate. If the child is born and the court approves the request, the results would be objective evidence. Until then, accusations remain accusations." Marcus slowly repeated those last words after ending the call. Objective evidence. For the first time since leaving his house, he felt something stronger than despair. He finally had a direction instead of simply defending himself against endless assumptions. The following morning, he sent a respectful message to Danielle. He did not argue. He did not accuse Alicia of lying. He simply wrote that he wanted a legally administered DNA test because it would establish the truth for everyone involved. Hours passed without a reply. Late that evening, a single notification appeared on his phone. Danielle had answered with only one sentence. "You are just trying to delay the inevitable." Marcus read the message several times before placing the phone on the kitchen counter inside his small apartment. He could have responded with frustration, but he knew nothing he wrote would change her mind. Instead, he opened a notebook and began recording every important conversation, every date, and every event he could remember from the weeks before his life unraveled. The more carefully he reconstructed the timeline, the more one unsettling detail continued to stand out. Alicia had avoided being alone with him for months before the accusation, yet somehow she had confidently claimed he was responsible. The contradiction lingered in his mind like a puzzle with one missing piece. Standing beside the apartment window as rain quietly tapped against the glass, Marcus realized that truth rarely announced itself with noise. Sometimes it waited patiently while lies exhausted themselves, and for the first time since Danielle closed the front door behind him, he believed that silence might become his strongest ally. Marcus expected Danielle to ignore his request for a DNA test, but he did not expect the silence to be interrupted by something even more unsettling. 3 days later, his attorney called with an update that made little sense. Danielle's legal representative had acknowledged the request, but insisted there was no reason to discuss testing until after the child was born. The answer sounded reasonable on the surface. Yet Marcus could not shake the feeling that everyone was treating the accusation as settled while treating the truth as an inconvenience. He thanked his attorney and returned to work, determined not to let frustration control him. Over the next week, he buried himself in schedules, delivery reports, and long hours at the distribution center. The steady rhythm of 18-wheelers arriving before sunrise and leaving before dusk gave him something predictable to hold on to. Even so, his thoughts always returned to the same unanswered question. Why would Alicia accuse him if she knew a DNA test would eventually expose the truth? One evening, as Marcus finished organizing paperwork in his apartment, his phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it before deciding to answer. The voice on the other end belonged to Danielle's cousin, Lisa, someone he had always respected because she rarely involved herself in family conflicts. She spoke carefully, almost whispering. "I probably should not be calling, but something feels wrong." Marcus remained quiet, allowing her to continue. Lisa explained that during a recent family dinner, Alicia had changed small details while answering simple questions. At first, she had claimed she discovered the pregnancy during one doctor's visit, but later she mentioned a different clinic and a different timeline. No one else seemed to notice because everyone was focused on comforting Danielle. Marcus listened without interrupting. These were not dramatic contradictions, but they were enough to make him pay closer attention. After thanking Lisa for her honesty, he ended the call and opened the notebook where he had been recording every conversation since leaving home. As he compared Lisa's observations with his own timeline, another inconsistency emerged. Alicia had told the family that Marcus had frequently been alone with her during the previous spring. Yet Marcus's work calendar showed he had spent nearly every weekend traveling between company warehouses in different cities. He still had hotel receipts, fuel purchases, electronic toll records, and work emails confirming his schedule. None of those documents proved what had happened, but they proved where he had been. For the first time, the accusation no longer felt impossible to challenge. The next morning, Marcus organized every receipt, calendar entry, and digital record into labeled folders before delivering copies to his attorney. The attorney studied the documents with growing interest. "These records do not answer every question," she admitted, "but they create serious issues with the timeline being presented against you." Marcus nodded slowly. He did not celebrate because he understood evidence required patience. Facts needed time to speak. Later that afternoon, Danielle unexpectedly called. Marcus answered immediately, surprised to hear her voice after weeks of silence. She sounded exhausted rather than angry. "My parents think you are trying to make Alicia look like a liar," she said quietly. Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter and closed his eyes. "I am not trying to embarrass anyone," he replied. "I only want the truth. If I am guilty, the DNA test will prove it. If I am innocent, it deserves to prove that too." Danielle did not answer right away. Marcus could hear only her slow breathing through the phone. Before ending the call, she asked one question that lingered in his thoughts long after the line went silent. "Why are you so certain the results will help you?" Marcus stared through the apartment window as the evening sun settled behind the buildings. His answer came without hesitation because it was the only thing he still possessed that no accusation could take away. "Because I know exactly who I am, Danielle, and sooner or later the truth always catches up with the story that tried to replace it. Time has a quiet way of exposing the cracks that anger refuses to notice." Nearly 6 weeks passed after Marcus asked for the DNA test, and life settled into a routine that looked peaceful from the outside but felt unbearably uncertain beneath the surface. Every weekday began before sunrise. Marcus drove the same familiar route to the distribution center, greeted the same employees with calm professionalism, and completed every responsibility expected of him. He had learned that discipline could become a shelter when emotions threatened to overwhelm reason. Even so, every evening ended inside the same modest apartment where silence had replaced the laughter that once filled his home. The divorce proceedings continued slowly, and although very little had changed legally, something subtle had begun shifting inside Danielle's world. Lisa called Marcus again one Sunday afternoon after returning from another family gathering. She explained that Alicia had become increasingly withdrawn. She rarely joined conversations for long, and whenever relatives mentioned the upcoming arrival of the baby, she quickly changed the subject or excused herself from the room. More than once, family members noticed her growing anxious whenever someone mentioned medical appointments or legal paperwork. Marcus listened carefully without offering conclusions. He understood that suspicion alone proved nothing. Only facts mattered now. A few days later, his attorney informed him that discussions regarding the DNA test had finally become more productive. Because Marcus had consistently requested objective testing from the beginning, the court viewed his request as reasonable rather than confrontational. Hearing those words brought him quiet relief. He had spent weeks resisting the temptation to defend himself through arguments, interviews, or emotional confrontations. Instead, he had placed his confidence in evidence, believing that truth never benefited from unnecessary noise. Danielle, however, was living with a different kind of burden. Although she never contacted Marcus again, mutual acquaintances quietly shared that she had become unusually distant from everyone around her. She attended work, visited her parents, and continued preparing for the divorce, but the certainty that had once fueled her anger appeared to be fading. Questions had begun replacing confidence. Small inconsistencies in Alicia's story surfaced during ordinary conversations. Dates no longer matched. Details shifted slightly from one explanation to another. Individually, they seemed insignificant, but together they formed a pattern that became increasingly difficult to ignore. One rainy evening, Marcus received an unexpected email from the hospital confirming preliminary arrangements for future genetic testing after the child's birth, pending final legal authorization from all parties. He read the message twice before quietly placing his laptop aside. The waiting was far from over, but for the first time, every step ahead followed an official process instead of rumors and assumptions. Later that night, Marcus stood on the apartment balcony watching headlights move across the wet streets below. He thought about the life he had lost, the marriage he still mourned, and the woman who had once believed in him without hesitation. He realized that even if the DNA test cleared his name completely, it could never restore the trust that had disappeared the moment accusations replaced conversation. That realization hurt more than he expected, yet it also brought unexpected clarity. Vindication and reconciliation were not the same thing. One could be measured by evidence. The other depended upon faith that had already been broken. As another week quietly passed, Marcus's attorney finally called with news that caused him to straighten in his chair before saying a single word. Every required signature had now been secured. The DNA testing process was officially moving forward, and for the first time since the nightmare began, the truth no longer felt distant. It was coming closer with every passing day, carrying an answer that none of them would be able to argue with once it finally arrived. The morning the laboratory scheduled the official DNA collection arrived with surprising ordinary calm, as though the world had no idea that several lives were about to be measured against a single scientific truth. Marcus parked outside the medical center nearly 30 minutes early. He remained inside his car for a few moments, watching nurses, patients, and families enter through the automatic glass doors. Everyone carried their own private concerns, completely unaware that he had spent months waiting for this day. He took a slow breath, straightened his shirt, and walked inside with the quiet determination that had carried him through every accusation. The reception area was brightly lit and almost silent except for the occasional voice calling a patient's name. Marcus checked in, signed the required forms, and sat near the window. A few minutes later, Danielle entered the waiting room. She looked noticeably different from the woman who had ordered him to leave their home. The confidence that had once filled every movement had been replaced by visible exhaustion. Their eyes met for only a brief second before she quietly took a seat across the room. Neither of them spoke. There were no angry words left to exchange. Only unanswered questions remained. Alicia arrived shortly afterward, accompanied by her attorney. She appeared unusually tense, repeatedly adjusting the sleeve of her sweater while avoiding eye contact with everyone around her. Marcus noticed something he had never seen before. Whenever a nurse mentioned paperwork or identification, Alicia hesitated for just a fraction of a second before responding. It was subtle enough that most people would never notice, but after months of studying every inconsistency, Marcus could not ignore it. The testing process itself was simple, professional, and surprisingly brief. A laboratory technician carefully explained every step, verified each person's identity, and collected the required DNA samples under strict documentation procedures. No accusations were discussed. No opinions were offered. The science did not care about rumors, emotions, or family conflicts. It only cared about evidence. As Marcus watched the sealed sample containers disappear into secure transport packaging, he experienced something he had not felt in months. Hope no longer depended upon convincing anyone. From this point forward, the facts would speak for themselves. Before leaving the medical center, Danielle unexpectedly approached him near the parking lot. She stood several feet away, leaving enough space to make it clear. That trust had not yet returned. Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain. If the results come back the way you believe they will, what happens then? Marcus looked toward the clear blue sky before answering. The truth happens, he said gently. Whether it helps us or hurts us, it deserves to be known. Danielle lowered her eyes without responding. She remained standing there long after Marcus walked toward his car. Days passed, then another week. The waiting became more difficult now that there was nothing left to do. Marcus focused on work, exercised every morning, and continued rebuilding a routine that no longer depended upon expectations about the future. He understood that some answers required patience. Then, late one Friday afternoon, his attorney called. Marcus immediately recognized the change in her voice. She sounded composed, but unmistakably serious. The laboratory has completed the analysis, she said. The official report has been released. The court has scheduled a meeting for everyone involved early Monday morning, so the findings can be presented simultaneously. Marcus slowly closed his office door and sat down without speaking. Months of uncertainty had finally narrowed into a single weekend. Across the city, Danielle received the same notification. Alicia did as well. None of them knew exactly what those sealed pages contained, But each of them understood that by Monday morning, every assumption, every accusation, and every painful decision would be forced to stand beside one thing that could not be argued with. The truth had finally arrived, and it was waiting inside an unopened envelope. Monday morning arrived with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. Marcus entered the courthouse conference room a few minutes before the scheduled meeting, carrying nothing except a small folder and the quiet confidence he had protected for months. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long reflections across the polished wooden table where everyone would soon gather. Danielle sat beside her attorney with tired eyes that revealed another weekend without sleep. Her parents occupied the seats behind her, speaking only in hushed whispers. Alicia arrived last. She stepped into the room slowly, avoiding every face except her attorney's. Marcus noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the strap of her purse before sitting down. The room remained silent until the court-appointed facilitator entered with a sealed document bearing the laboratory's official certification. There were no dramatic announcements and no emotional speeches. The facilitator simply confirmed everyone's identity, explained that the DNA analysis had been completed according to established legal procedures, and carefully opened the report. Every sound seemed louder than usual. The turning of each page echoed through the room. Marcus folded his hands together and waited. He had imagined this moment countless times, yet now that it had finally arrived, he discovered he felt surprisingly calm. The facilitator looked down at the final page before speaking in a steady, professional voice. Based upon the genetic analysis performed by the accredited laboratory, Marcus Bennett is excluded as the biological father of the child. The probability of paternity is 0%. For several seconds, no one moved. The words settled over the room with a weight that no accusation had ever carried. Marcus lowered his eyes and quietly released a breath he had been holding for months. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply sat there as the truth finally spoke on his behalf. Danielle stared at the report as though she no longer understood the language printed across its pages. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Slowly, she turned toward Marcus. Searching his face for something that had disappeared the night she asked him to leave. What she found instead was quiet sadness rather than triumph. Her father removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead in disbelief. Her mother covered her mouth with trembling fingers as tears filled her eyes. Across the table, Alicia remained completely motionless. The confidence that had once supported every accusation had vanished, replaced by an expression Marcus had never seen before. It was not anger. It was fear. The facilitator continued reviewing procedural information, but almost. No one seemed to hear another sentence. The only fact that mattered had already been spoken aloud. Marcus was innocent. Every whispered conversation, every broken friendship, every lonely night inside the apartment, and every judgment passed without evidence suddenly stood exposed beneath one undeniable scientific conclusion. Danielle finally found her voice, though it barely rose above a whisper. "Marcus," she began before stopping again. He looked at her calmly, without resentment. There was nothing left for him to prove. The report resting on the table had already accomplished that. As everyone prepared to leave, the facilitator gathered the documents and reminded the parties that the DNA results answered only one legal question. Other matters would require separate discussions. Those words lingered in the air because everyone understood what they meant. The laboratory had revealed who was not responsible, but it had not explained why Marcus had been accused in the first place. As Alicia slowly stood from her chair, she briefly glanced toward the door instead of toward her family. Marcus noticed the hesitation, the uncertainty, and the quiet panic she could no longer conceal. For the first time since this nightmare began, the accusation had collapsed. Now only one question remained, and sooner or later someone would have to answer it. If Marcus was innocent all along, then who had been hiding the truth from the very beginning? A single laboratory report had restored Marcus Bennett's innocence, but it had also left an emptiness that no document could explain. The courthouse slowly emptied as attorneys gathered their files and family members drifted toward the parking lot in stunned silence. Marcus had almost reached his car when he heard someone quietly call his name. He turned to find Danielle standing several yards away. Her eyes were red, not from anger this time, but from the crushing realization that certainty without evidence had cost her everything. She opened her mouth as though rehearsing countless apologies at once, yet none of them seemed capable of crossing the distance between them. Marcus offered a polite nod, but before either of them could speak, another voice interrupted the silence. Wait. Alicia stood near the courthouse entrance, her shoulders lowered as though she had finally grown too tired to carry the weight she had been hiding. Her attorney looked at her with visible concern, but Alicia slowly shook her head. I cannot keep doing this anymore, she said, her voice trembling. Everyone stopped. Danielle turned toward her younger sister in complete confusion. Their parents remained frozen where they stood, sensing that another truth was about to surface. Alicia drew a slow breath before speaking again. Marcus never did anything wrong. The words seemed almost impossible to absorb even after the DNA report. Danielle stared at her sister without blinking. Then why? She whispered. Alicia lowered her eyes toward the sidewalk. I was afraid. She explained that months earlier she had discovered she was expecting a child after a brief relationship that ended almost as quickly as it began. The child's biological father had made it clear that he did not intend to be involved, and Alicia had panicked. She feared disappointing her family, feared facing their questions, and feared raising a child while carrying the burden alone. Instead of admitting the truth, she convinced herself that naming someone the family already trusted would delay the consequences she was too frightened to face. Marcus had always treated her with kindness, and she believed that made him the easiest person to accuse because no one would imagine she could invent such a story. Once the accusation spread, she no longer knew how to stop it. Every passing day made telling the truth more difficult than the day before. Danielle slowly stepped backward as tears rolled down her face. She was no longer looking at Marcus. She was looking at the sister she had defended without hesitation. Their parents stood speechless, unable to reconcile the daughter they loved with the confession unfolding before them. Marcus remained completely still. Months earlier, he had imagined what he might say if the truth were ever revealed. Now that the moment had arrived, he discovered he felt no desire to argue, criticize, or seek revenge. The confession had already exposed the damage more completely than any angry words ever could. Alicia looked directly at Marcus for the first time since this nightmare had begun. I am sorry, she whispered. You did not deserve any of this. Marcus studied her face for several quiet seconds before answering. You cannot change what happened, he said gently, but you can spend the rest of your life choosing honesty over fear. His voice carried neither bitterness nor satisfaction. It carried only the exhaustion of someone who had survived a storm he never created. As Alicia broke into quiet tears and Danielle covered her face with trembling hands, Marcus realized that the greatest tragedy had never been the false accusation itself. It had been how quickly trust disappeared when fear became louder than truth, and how difficult it would now be for every person standing there to rebuild what had been broken. 3 months passed before Marcus Bennett finally drove past the neighborhood where he and Danielle had once imagined growing old together. The house no longer felt like home. It had become a place where trust disappeared faster than truth could defend itself. He did not stop the car. He simply continued toward the highway as the morning sunlight spread across the windshield, reminding him that some chapters were not meant to be revisited. His divorce had been finalized with quiet professionalism. There had been no arguments in the courtroom, no attempts to rewrite history, and no dramatic confrontation. The official documents ended a marriage, but they could never fully describe everything that had been lost the day one accusation became stronger than years of loyalty. Marcus accepted that reality with the same dignity that had carried him through every lonely night. Work gradually became more than a distraction. His consistency earned the respect of his supervisors, and before long, he was promoted to oversee regional operations across several distribution centers. The promotion did not erase the pain of the past, but it reminded him that character revealed itself over time. While rumors had once tried to define him, his actions quietly rebuilt the reputation that lies had temporarily stolen. One afternoon, Danielle asked if they could meet at a small coffee shop halfway between their neighborhoods. Marcus agreed without expectation. When he arrived, she was already waiting near the window, turning a paper cup slowly between her hands. She looked healthier than she had in months, yet the sadness in her eyes remained. After a long silence, she finally spoke. She admitted that every apology she had rehearsed felt too small compared to the damage she had caused. She confessed that she had allowed fear, emotion, and blind trust to replace the conversations they should have shared as husband and wife. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he offered a gentle smile that carried neither bitterness nor hope. "I forgave you a long time ago," he said quietly. "Not because what happened was acceptable, but because I refused to let it decide the rest of my life." Tears filled Danielle's eyes. "Is there any chance we could start over?" she asked. Marcus looked out the window for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "Some things can be repaired," he answered softly. "Trust is different. Once it is broken before the truth is even heard, it does not return the way people wish it would." Danielle lowered her head, understanding that forgiveness and reconciliation were never the same gift. They finished their coffee in peaceful silence before standing to leave. Marcus wished her well, sincerely hoping she would find happiness again, but he no longer believed that happiness belonged beside him. As he walked toward his truck, he noticed the weight on his shoulders felt lighter than it had in nearly a year. He was not walking away from love. He was walking toward peace. Weeks later, Lisa sent him a brief message saying that Alicia had accepted responsibility for raising her child honestly and had begun rebuilding her relationship with the family through patience instead of excuses. Marcus read the message, smiled quietly, and placed his phone back into his pocket. He did not need apologies anymore. He needed only the freedom to keep moving forward. As the evening sun settled beyond the distant horizon, Marcus drove toward a future that no longer required anyone else's approval. The greatest victory had never been the DNA report or the public confession. It was the simple fact that he had refused to become bitter while waiting for the truth. His name had been cleared, his dignity had remained intact, and although he had lost the life he once planned, he had found something even more valuable along the way. He did not win his marriage back. He won himself.